I'm Larry Fedoruk, and welcome to a new episode of my podcast. I was 8. Childhood stories from that remarkable year growing up on the Great Canadian Prairie. Timelines curve and intersect a little, but these stories mostly happened as told. I was 8.
Chapter 11. A Boy and His Dog.
Yes, a boy and his dog. Hey, you had to think that if I'm doing a series of stories about childhood, that there had to be a boy and his dog story. I guess this is it. Actually, by the time I was 8, I was on my 3rd dog, and I wanted this to be about him. A great dog. But let's get there. The very first dog, I barely remember. What I remember most about him, truthfully, was his death. Eee. I was just a toddler, and we lived out in the country where my mom taught at a country school. It was right near my Uncle Joe's farm. The good Uncle Joe, not the evil one. The dog's name was Brownie, and apparently we were inseparable. Except one day, he just went missing. A second day passed, and a third. Where was Brownie? I assumed Brownie was just away on dog work. I had noted that Dad also went missing for days at a time and returned home dirty and with an empty lunch pail. Perhaps Brownie also had a job on the railroad. Perhaps, yes, Mom said. Yes, perhaps. Apparently not. Days later, playing in the yard, I saw my Uncle Joe on the road driving his tractor. I ran excitedly toward him. Perhaps he'd give me a ride. He was waving at me, I was waving at him. When I got to the road, I could see that my Uncle Joe was actually waving me back. Back. Why? Because at the end of a chain tied to the tractor was Brownie, dead. Brownie had apparently been sick, possibly later attacked, and my Uncle Joe found him near some bushes in a field. He was towing him to another field for burial. The last time I saw my constant companion was in a cloud of dust at the end of a chain, being dragged to his own interment. I was just a toddler, not sure I understood life and death, but this was dead. Brownie was dead. So the immediate effect for me is that when Brownie and I were out playing and Mom would call me in for the evening, I rarely came. Yeah, I'm busy. So Mom would just call the dog. He obeyed her, and Mom knew that I would just follow the dog. So when I told Mom about Brownie and the chain and the tractor, she explained that now when she called me, I would have to learn to come in on my own. All right, Brownie's dead, and I've got more responsibility now. Got it. A couple of years later, we moved into town. I started grade 1, and there was no talk of getting the boy another dog, or even of the boy wanting another dog. I was living in town now, 1,000 people town. The hustle, the bustle. We had TV. I owned comic books, and the town had a candy store that became the center of my universe. Why would I need a dog? And besides, dogs weren't for town. Dogs worked on farms. They helped herd the cattle. They chased away foxes. They barked and chased at cars when visitors came. That's how on the farm you knew company was coming 5 minutes before they arrived. All the dogs were barking. Farm dogs slept outside or in a dog house. On really cold nights, they could share the barn with the horses and cows. They weren't expected to play with the farm kids or be pets. If there was a pet aspect to a farm dog, that was just a bonus for the farm kids. Farm kids loved the dogs the same way they might grow fond of a little piglet or their favorite calf. Unlike the pig or the calf, though, the dogs would never appear months later on the dinner table next to a pot of boiled potatoes. So who needed a dog in the city, town? No one. So what would be the point? Despite this, a second dog did show up one day. I can't remember the circumstances, but I suspect that one of the sides of the family had a farm dog who had a large litter, and we took one of them off their hands. He was a tiny, clumsy ball of fur, white, some brown spots. I called him Butch. I referred to him as Butchie. The word for me had no other meaning, just a good name for a dog. Butchie. That summer, my mom lived in the city for a couple of months to complete a summer course toward her degree. My dad took care of me, which meant a lot more potato chips and Pepsi, and a lot of time with Butchie. I had taught him a few basic things, the best one being go fetch. I threw a tennis ball in the yard, and he would chase it, he'd pick it up in his mouth, and bring it back to me. Eventually. Sometimes it would take him like 10 minutes because he got distracted on the way back chasing a bee, but he did return with the ball. So I told my friends my dog knew go fetch. One day my idiot friend Philip was passing by and asked for a glass of water. I showed him Butchie's go fetch trick, and Philip said that's not really go fetching. I told Philip he could have a drink from the hose. We'd visit my mom some weekends, but I was really excited this one week because Mom had finished summer school and was coming home. One more sleep. Tomorrow I'd show Mom how I had taught Butchie the go fetch trick. I'll just get to this quickly. Across the back lane, our neighbor used to have this garage with a concrete floor. The garage was torn down years ago and they just had this slab of concrete. They used it as a parking spot. There in the middle of the slab of concrete, I found Butchie in a small pool of blood with flies buzzing around his head. I recognized this. I remember this. This is dead. Butchie was dead. I summoned Dad and watched as he scraped Butchie up in a big snow shovel and put him in a box. He would bury him later. Dad thought maybe Butchie was hit by a car and staggered into the laneway in the neighbor's yard. Later that day when Mom got home, I shared the news and I took her out to the backyard to show her exactly how the go-fetch routine would have worked. I asked her to imagine if Butchie were still alive fetching the tennis ball. I had to play both parts, me and Butchie. And I remember Mom saying, "Don't put that disgusting tennis ball in your mouth." So these are just two awful stories. I'm sorry they're so awful, but you know what? They weren't horrible to me as a kid. Or maybe they were. Who knows what plays on a kid's psyche? I did cry when Butchie died, but then life went on because it had to. You lost your dog. Sad. But you know, it wasn't Grandma. All the people in my life were still there. One would think that after all this, the chances of a third dog entering our lives would be nil. Less than zero even. And for a couple of years, there was no other dog. Until around the time I was 8. Occasionally on Fridays, Dad would get home early from work. Well, early for him, and I was allowed to stay up late to see him. Well, late for me. Sometimes on those Fridays, Dad would bring me something. On this particular Friday, when Dad got home, he was carrying a little cardboard box and holding it Very carefully, he put the box on the kitchen table, and inside I saw the tiniest little black puppy, fast asleep and silent, except for the occasional whimpering. Dad explained that our town veterinarian had found a box of abandoned little puppies. They were black collie puppies. Only 3 had survived, and my dad agreed to take one. He also told me that the vet gave the puppy a lot of medicine and that he'd be mostly asleep or groggy for a day or 2. Got it, understood, because, sometimes Dad was like that for a couple of days. We heard the dog most of the night, whining and whimpering. Quite late the next day, he was up and about. I'd pet him, and his little paw would always reach out, so I shook his paw. We decided Wimpy was the perfect name because of the whimpering. And now I knew 3 Wimpies. Wimpy from the Popeye cartoons, my dad's friend Wimpy, whose name was actually Stan, but he looked like Wimpy from the Popeye cartoons, and now my dog Wimpy. Mom pointed out the spelling difference and the connection to whimpering, but we never pronounced the H. My dog was Wimpy. Let me also get to this part of the story quickly in case you are wondering about the dreaded train tracks or the asteroid that fell out of the sky. Oh my gosh, what are the odds? Poor dog. No. Wimpy lived about 12 years. I grew up with Wimpy. He was a handsome black collie, and every time I came near, he offered his paw. Before we did anything together, we always shook on it first. It may have been a reflex from his drug days, but I didn't care. It's like my dog arrived already knowing a trick, and he learned all the others too. Fetch, roll over, all of them. The funniest part was when Wimpy came with me to the schoolyard when all of us kids played football. Wimpy was a calm, content dog until the snap, 'cause he was a collie, a herding dog. The idea of all of us kids running willy-nilly around a field drove him nuts. He ran all around, barking. He tried to herd us. Once we were back in the huddle, he sat quietly until the next play. Years later, we would move to the city, the real city this time, the big one. And no one took a dog to the city. Why would you need a dog in the city? There was no cattle, no foxes. Chasing cars was not a thing. My Uncle Joe, the good one, offered to take Wimpy to be one of his farm dogs, even though Wimpy was half their size and not nearly as aggressive. We thought that would be a better life for him. We took him to the farm, said our goodbyes, we shook on it, and I started my life as an urban bon vivant. Well, more like a country hick who was now going to high school in a city with a bunch of kids he didn't know. But I'm trying to erase that memory. Months later, we drove out to my Uncle Joe's for a Sunday visit. As we turned up the long driveway, the dogs came out and started to bark and chase our car, and there was Wimpy, right along with them. Now, how this works on a farm is when the car stops, the farmer has to come out, call off the dogs, and then you can walk into the house. But not this time. It was Wimpy who herded all the other dogs back to the shed they called home. And then Wimpy came back. When I got out of the car, he offered his paw. We shook hands hello and spent some quality time together. Afterward, my Uncle Joe told me that Wimpy was his lead dog, that soon after his arrival, he just took over. And if my Uncle Joe got some new dogs, it was Wimpy who whipped the new recruits into shape. He ran the show. He was top dog, top herder, and also top pet for my cousins. I was so proud of Wimpy. That was my dog. Oh, and on the farm, he never whimpered. I think he knew that would be a sign of weakness, After all, he was their leader. It would be years later, as my Uncle Joe told the story, that one night he did hear him whimpering from the doghouse, and then he just stopped. And the next day, my Uncle Joe had to fire up the tractor.
I Was 8 is a weekly series written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. A new episode every Thursday. Share your stories with Larry, or if you like, share Larry's stories with a friend. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Larry Fedoruk, that's Fedoruk, can be reached at larryfedoruk37@gmail.com.